Hi, I'm Joe, and I am with Normalize, and I am excited to introduce today an old friend of mine and CISO at Netlify, Mark Dorsi. Mark, thanks for joining me today. I would love to share some of your experience and knowledge with our customers and our partners. If you could introduce yourself and give us a little background on your role and what you're doing today, that'd be great.
Yeah, super excited to be joining. It's a great opportunity to sort of get out there what Netlify has been doing from an overall security program perspective, as well as discuss some of the top topics of today when it comes down to things like access control. So super excited to have a great conversation with you today.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I've been following you. You're really a visionary in access governance, modern passwordless approaches, and I catching up prior to this. I got to understand your team is really following in with that, and you're building a great, lightweight digital organization. So today, most of my customers, when they're concerned about data security, it's really about knowing where that data is and who can access it. And that's obviously a difficult conversation, a hard question to answer today. How do you make that a manageable process, especially in the line of business that Netlify is in?
Well, this always comes down to attack surface. And the way we look at it is that everything as it comes into a particular environment from an access perspective or any other method from that perspective is really all about access control. And everything really is a vulnerability when it comes right down to it. And so when we take a look at that, we take a look at someone coming into an environment, we really do want to be able to control that access. And we just consider that every bit of access into an environment is what we consider to be a moment where someone needs to, quote unquote, break the glass. And what do we mean by that? It means that as someone comes into an environment, we really want to find a better way in order to provide access to a piece of data, the ability to administrate that environment. And that's what you've really seen in the industry across the board, which is how can folks reduce their attack surface over time? And really, the first starting point is always around access control and figuring out who has access to what, why do they have access, and whether or not you'll be able to pair that access back in time, either automatically or otherwise, so that really the crown jewels, or what we call, overall data security, is maintained and remains intact.
How do you measure both, friction from a process like that, as well as success?
Yeah, we look at this in a couple of different ways, and it's really all around the behavioral patterns from an individual and what they access. So the way that access is normally granted in an environment, or at least I've seen in the past, is that folks will say, oh, please give John the same access that Mary has, especially when it's a new environment. And that happens across the board. And so what ends up happening is so an administrator goes in, finds Mary, finds John, and then grants that particular access. And so what we end up doing is figuring out ways to measure the overall access requests and really the frequency of access that goes on within an environment, so that in time, we can figure out what a group actually needs the ability to have access to. And in which case, we can then measure sort of day one productivity. And we then start to grant folks access based on that. However, at the same time, we do take a look at that group and figure out whether or not that access can be automatically paired back. And combo with that, we will take a look and we'll say, okay, if it can't be automatically paired back because they're actually using the access, can we systematically find a way for them to gain access to the things they need to do in a different way? This could be through CI/CD type automation, the Terraforms and those sorts of things within the world. Or maybe it's just moving more data into the ETL. Regardless, it's still an overall attack path. And we want to figure out how do we minimize the overall attack surface associated with that so that in time, folks will have the right access to data, and it's in a controlled method. And we know that that person is who they say they are because they have some type of physical token, which is our whole journey into passwordless.
Hardware tokens, federated access. Obviously, these are trends that industry is moving in. I think you're spearheading a lot of that. Where do you see, yourself against the industry? Other organizations are struggling with this and dealing with acquisitions and expansions. Where do you see yourself against your peers, and what do you hear, when you're having those conversations?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There is a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt when it comes into things like physical tokens, the ability to use Touch ID and those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. What I find, though, in each one of the organizations that we work with is that as an individual begins to use Touch ID or a physical token, they find out right away that it's much simpler than it ever was before. Having to remember a complex password or something to that effect, and there's password policies, rotations. It wasn't long enough, it's too short. It doesn't have the right number of characters. Those sorts of things always come to be a problem for folks. And so having the ability to sort of touch a physical device that's located on your computer and authorizing that particular device has been really sort of transformative for folks. A couple of things that we found out along the way is that folks were using, of course, different devices to authorize themselves. And one of the most interesting ones was a wearable. And that's one of the areas where you come to find out quickly that a wearable like your watch or maybe a special, type of ring that's close to the device or something to that effect, like some of those things will end up breaking as you move into passwordless. And so you end up with a little bit of friction there. But overall, the experience for the user actually improves when they stop using passwords, which is fantastic. And sort of pressing into this space as time goes on, I think more and more folks will find that it actually streamlines what's going on. And then, of course, your biggest threat becomes token resets. And how do you avoid adding a new token into the environment because somebody was clever enough to call into your support staff and get a new token added into an account? So there's always a new attack path. The question is whether or not you've been able to shut down more and more over time and really secure overall access into the environment.
How do you profile the risk of a particular user or type of user? And I know when we talked, you mentioned doing behavior analysis to help you determine what people should have access to. And I took that as a note, maybe of a wish rather than a today. Was that right?
Well, as I look at a user and their overall profile, I really look at this from a data classification perspective. And that's really where we've gone down from a path is concerned. All applications, all of the access that someone might get is all based on security clearance for a particular group and or set of assets. And really, when you think about it, like the concept of the security clearance goes way back in time. You either have the proper security clearance in order to see a certain type of data or you don't. And that's really what we've moved to from an access control perspective, which is an individual or a set of applications has a particular security clearance. And as such, they're able to get automatic access into that environment. And so from a behavioral perspective, the question is whether or not we're able to really classify that individual using some sort of identity provider and get them into that class of applications that gives them that level of access. And as you really expand your overall data classification usage, it gets into all sorts of things. We use this from a vendor management policy perspective, all the way into the data classification type, into the data access type stuff that we're discussing today. And in that way, it's really simple decision. The individual with a particular role at a particular period of time has access to data or they don't, based on their overall security clearance as it comes from sort of their day one access perspective. And that's really the way we look at it. As time goes on, we look at least a privilege and least access sort of principles. We then look to pair folks back in access in time. And what does that mean? It means that an individual could have access to a particular piece of data because their role needed that a little bit ago. For whatever number of reasons. If they haven't used it though in 45 days, we automatically pair back that data and access to that data. Why do we do that? Well, because it seems as though the overall usage isn't there and we don't necessarily need to provide them with that type of data as it goes forward. So we just automatically pair it back. And that's really important from an overall kind of attack surface perspective. If an individual still requires access, they can automatically request the access again. And if they're in the right role, right group, they can regain access to that data. If they don't, then then it just automatically gets paired back. Where is this helpful? This is helpful in sort of the classic triad of access. You're either a new employee, an exiting employee, or the most important one, a transitioning employee from an overall security perspective. So you had a role and you are transitioning to a new role. And over time, your behavior says that you are still doing work for a particular group and or entity that maybe you're no longer a part of. And maybe that's okay for the organization and they want that to go on in time. Well, as a part of the original team, after 45 days, you would have lost access and could have automatically received access again. But as a part of the new team, you're most likely going to have to go back to that particular owner of that application and re-request access so that you can properly do your job as it was and help out the organization. So these are important concepts for folks to layer into an environment, and they can be really tough in order to get right. But if you think about it from a data classification perspective and overall security clearance perspective as it comes to a set of data, and a set of access, it really does help simplify the overall decision-making process.
I would imagine that when it comes to compliance, it's a lot less complicated to present evidence to an auditor when you have this broken glass approach. But I assume there's also a cost in maintaining this. How did you justify that? How do you, how do you maintain the rigor when there is a big investment there?
There is a fairly substantial cost when you take on anything like this. Interestingly enough, it's the cost is in mostly in folks is coming to terms with it. The implementation oftentimes is straightforward in today's world. For example, you can use Okta or the One Logins of the world in order to really set up and access an identity provider type setup. What it comes down to, though, is are folks internally willing to adopt that mechanism as the way that you authorize yourself in order to get into systems and services? And that's really what it comes down to. But the technology's been out there for quite some time. So what did we end up doing? We went out and hired some folks whose primary directive is to go out and integrate as many apps as humanly possible into our IDP. And for those apps that really struggled in order to do that, the question comes down to whether or not we have some sort of compensating access point that can be used as that point of control and our point of removal. And so that, there are always moments where you have to go through and say, okay, we have to take some other route here in order to get a control in place. We can't totally remediate it. We're going to mitigate it, work on it in time. The question is the type of data again. So the type of data that you're accessing from a classification perspective, is it really like L0 data? Are these security credential type things? Or is it public data? And do we need to spend the time on it at this moment in time, right? Because every moment in an organization contains some amount of risk. The question is whether or not you should spend time in order to mitigate and then further remediate that risk. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes we have to accept some risk. We accept risk every day. We cross the street. We may jaywalk, we may not, we may use a crosswalk, but everything in life is risky. The question is whether or not you're willing to accept that risk, that vulnerability in that moment in time.
Mark, where would you go from here? And thanks for covering on the costs. Integrating a stack and standardizing when you're an organization that's complex, it can be a heavy lift. But
yeah,
from your perspective,
I would agree with that.
Did you have? I guess my thought was you would have had to put a pretty good argument to get everybody to agree to it. What was that?
So the initial argument was really we just showed folks sort of the way, which is we started with a very simple thing, which is getting into our identity provider. We swapped out for using FIDO tokens. That was like step one. And as soon as folks started using FIDO tokens to access things, they naturally adopted it in other places as fast as they could.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's so much simpler to implement. There's no password complexity. We dropped out all of these other requirements against all those sort of things. So you can imagine that if you have an internal application and it's been evaluated by the security team, and the security team comes back and says, well, you're missing all the ability to age out folks, password complexity, all this other sort of stuff. So you're going to need to implement 30 controls, or you can drop all of that and just hit the identity provider for access. Tell us which path you want to go. And so immediately everybody's like, oh yeah, well, this is far simpler. And within just a couple of hours, they were able to implement the change and then get those changes rolled out, tested. And of course, there can be issues in time, but we're able to pretty quickly work through those. And the team being able to implement and plug into the identity provider versus having to create robust authentication authorization systems just really became something where like, no, we don't actually want to do that. All we wanted to do is provide this sort of simple access into an application. Perfect. Then we'll control it from over here, and y'all can have the sort of ability to focus on what matters to the business most, which is the features that help either support our customers or the features that our customers directly use. We really want our folks to spend time on the things that our customers need most, and that's our time and directed time and attention. If we can focus on them, they'll be far happier in time versus our internal developers trying to figure out, and as it always says, right, roll your own crypto. Please never do this. It goes into roll your own authentication mechanism, authorization mechanisms. It's better to leverage a third party when it's not your core business, and that's really the stance we've taken.
And how do you manage encryption, especially in the cloud, and access to encrypted data?
So what we end up doing is we end up leveraging tools across the board in order to tell us just how we're doing from an overall encryption perspective. And of course, encryption for us comes in a couple different ways. There's the classic ones, sort of in transit or at rest. And I think that those are always interesting. But really, applications that can tell you things like in store are far more important. Whether or not you're actually encrypting the data all the way through is super important. Yes, it's great that AWS will encrypt all of your things and GCP will do the same, and you just click the button. But the question is, what happens when that data is actually in runtime? And who's accessing that data? What are the keys that have access to that data? And do we have the visibility into that? And that's really where we've taken a look at tools like Normalize in order to help us out in these situations. Do our keys have the proper hygiene associated with them? Do our secrets have the proper hygiene associated with them, right? Because they're the keys to the kingdom. They allow access into the environment, regardless of all the other controls that we've put in place. So the question is whether or not we have the right hygiene around them and whether or not the data that's associated with those is properly encrypted, so that regardless of the type of key, right? You can have all these keys, but if folks can just see the data by looking through the fence on the side, that it's, what did you really secure at the end of the day? So the question is it encrypted in transit, at rest, and is it encrypted in runtime, and only decrypted when the right folks actually need to see it? And you can imagine for a platform like a Netlify, it's the core to our business. We actually build live in runtime using keys and provide out this content to our customers and those customers' customers so that they have an amazing web experience. Well, all those keys require amazing hygiene. And that's really what Netlify has done. We've gone out and we're really bullish on really targeting the overall security of those keys, all of the keys involved in environments, so that data is kept safe and secure and only exposed at those moments when our customers would expect that to be the case. Super critical in that way.
Where are you headed next, Mark? What's the next big challenge?
I think the next big challenge is just in that particular space. We've really pressed on access control, ensuring that access to data for humans is what it should be. The next big frontiers for us is all around not only secret hygiene from an overall Netlify perspective and the secrets that we use in order to manage our service, but really pressing into the customer space and ensuring that they have the right hygiene around their secrets. Because we're only as good as we allow the customers in order to really secure their data from a secrets management perspective. How do we allow our customers to ensure that any secret that enters the environment has the right hygiene policies associated with it, and that they're able to properly control access to their data at the right time with all of the different systems that they might bring a part of an environment? When you think of a Netlify, Netlify is really the conductor of a symphony of services put together by the composer, which is our customer, for their audience. And so what we want to do is ensure that their audience has the best experience possible and that our customers' intellectual property, their brand, is properly protected. So what do we need to do? Ensure that the keys associated with their data itself, and our overall administration of that data is kept safe and secure at all times. At no point do we want a brand reputation issue with one of our customers. And as such, we've really spent a lot of time around overall key management, key hygiene for ourselves, our customers, as well as really cranking on fraud and abuse at Netlify. We have leading edge type technology, which allows us to really crank down so that the enterprise overall is served well. And we are very sure that their data is kept safe and secure.
How do you manage data across different views? Who's responsible for determining the level of access in an ETL stack? Is that a challenge you're seeing, or is that something you've addressed?
We see these types of problems. Every single organization I've ever been in has some sort of issue with ETL. And the question is, what type of data is allowed to make it into that other environment where more folks can see it, right, and take that data apart? And it really comes down to the core foundation from a company perspective. Do you consider the privacy of customer data the top priority within your organization? And Netlify, we do. And so we want to be really careful with the type of data that makes it into different environments so that the data that is transformed and is available for data analysis really has been anonymized before it makes it into that environment. Are there challenges with this? Of course, every organization has this type of a problem. The question is whether or not the data team has access to only what they need to have access to, and have we ensured on the other side that the proper handshake has happened so that we're doing our very best to only provide the data that they should have. The way I look at sort of data transfer is that it's a handshake. The individual on one side of the handshake needs to ensure that they're only providing the right amount of data, and the individual on the other side needs to ensure that they've only received the right amount of data. So the question that we normally have for folks is, are you only trying to bring in the data that you need, or are you trying to bring in all the data, right? It's select star versus select very certain fields from within an environment. And so those types of controls, where you have put in some system side controls in order to try and ensure that that data only makes it out where it should go. And then number two is, are those folks on the other side alerting you and letting you know, actually, we have too much data? And those are important moments for teams to have, and important conversations for folks to say, actually, I don't need that data. That wasn't what the request is for. So how do we address this? We address this in a couple of different ways. System side, of course, we have controls in place in order to ensure that, yes, the right side of data is sent, the right side of data is selected. And then we also have the training that goes involved with that. So we let folks know it's okay to say, look, you're giving me too much. Can you please give me less? Can you please send less? Right? Those things are important moments. In order to follow that up, though, the security team needs really good visibility across the different environments. How do we know that the right data is being sent from a particular data source out to the end user folks as expected? And so we go out and we employ tools like a Normalize in order to ensure that we understand the overall life cycle of data, so that when we do understand when folks have access to data, are they using sort of the proper keys in order to do that? And at the end of the day, are they receiving too little or too much data? ETL can be a big problem for an organization. It is the place where data can, quote unquote, leak out if you're not careful. And so you should really pay attention to those environments. If you haven't had a look at your ETL infrastructure and what's in there, you should probably do that today.
If I was managing an organization that was primarily on-premise, and I was, moving, and I aspired to be an organization as agile as Netlify, what are the pitfalls that I should avoid? And, what are the top three things you would advise?
Yeah, so the top three things I would really recommend, to a company who's really making a transition to the cloud at this point in time. Number one, go back and take a look at that data classification policy. Ensure that you're covering data in the same way that you would have always wanted to, and begin to really leverage that in order to understand just how you're going to provide access to data and systems. The cloud will bring in all sorts of new areas for you to consider. But if you have an easy decision point, not just for yourself, but for the entire organization to take, then it's not you, the security team or the compliance team, going out and trying to figure out, okay, which app is here, which app is there. You could really enable the business to take those decisions on their own. And that's a really big time savings, because you'll end up with champions across the organization. And if you are pointing to that data classification policy, folks will go in and provide you information in time that says, and feedback that says this is either resonating with them or it's not. That's really kind of number one. Number two is I really press into access control. Of course, access control is paramount over all other things, but until you understand just how you're granting access based on data classification, really tough to press into access control world, because you don't really understand what you're controlling access to. Sometimes you have to start there, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, you want to ensure that data's been classified, so you understand who has access to it, and that the folks are on board with that type of classification. It really can simplify an overall approach to things. And you can say things like, oh, well, if it's an L3 type vendor, so it's a public type vendor, or maybe you're an L4, you can say, okay, this is a public type data location. Actually, we don't need a ton of controls. Just give us their SOC 2 report, this, that, or the other thing, and it can automatically go through the system. And you take all that burden off the security team and compliance team from a review perspective. It's just not feasible to do that. So you think about data classification into access control. So now you know what overall you're doing from an access perspective. And number three, of course, is always visibility for the team. Do you have the right visibility so that you understand when things go bump in the night? And do you have the right visibility to understand just where does data lie? Who has access to that data? What keys, what individuals have access to that? So that in time, you can start to pare back that access automatically. If there's one thing I can recommend, though, go back, take a look at your data classification policy and apply that to your access control. It will save you a ton of time.